When you look at the skyline of a major metropolis, you see these towering skyscrapers,
Right.
and you intuitively understand that these massive structures, they weren't just built overnight. They're the result of meticulous planning, decades of labor, thousands of tons of steel.
And a foundation poured deep into the bedrock.
Exactly. You trust that a building of that magnitude is permanent. But what if you watched one of those skyscrapers, a towering institution that defined a city's horizon for over 4 decades, just be systematically dismantled?
Dismantled and demolished in a matter of months.
Yeah, and not by a natural disaster, but by the very people holding the deed. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are operating under the banner of Peak to Dust, and we're conducting a forensic investigative autopsy of a fallen giant, the Seattle Supersonics.
And to you, the listener, we really invite you to observe this dissection closely, because it requires a very specific kind of forensic examination.
It really does.
We're looking at how something so structurally sound, so vibrant on the basketball court, could be completely undermined and hollowed out in the boardroom.
We're tracing the exact sequence of events that allowed a 41-year cultural and athletic institution to simply, vanish into thin air.
Leaving behind only a bitter legacy, an empty arena, and this phantom silhouette on the Seattle skyline.
So let's jump straight into the bedrock of this thing. The year is 1967. The NBA is expanding, and an ownership group led by a California businessman named Sam Schulman secures a franchise.
Right, for a $1 million expansion fee.
Which is, today that sounds like nothing, but back then.
Oh, to put it into context, it was a staggering figure. Today, NBA franchises are valued in the billions. But in 1967, $1 million was a massive, almost unprecedented sum of capital to risk on a new professional basketball team.
Wow.
And the ownership group immediately tied the team's identity to the economic lifeblood of the city, which was the aerospace industry.
Specifically, they took their name from Boeing's supersonic transport project, the SST.
Which is an ironic beginning, honestly.
Yeah, considering the SST project was canceled just a few years later, and that triggered massive layoffs and economic turbulence in the Pacific Northwest.
And the team's early years on the court mirrored that turbulence perfectly. Under their first head coach, Al Bianchi, the roster featured players like Bob Rule, Al Tucker, and the famously aggressive Tom Meschery.
Right. They were an incredible offensive highlight reel, but just an absolute sieve on defense.
An absolute disaster structurally.
In their inaugural season, they were the third highest scoring team in the league. They averaged 118.7 points per game. But the problem was they surrendered an astronomical 125.1 points per game to their opponents.
So they were an entertaining distraction, but that was it. They were drawing only about 6,500 fans a night.
Which is nothing.
Nothing. And they finished that first season with a dismal 23-59 record. The foundational integrity required to build a champion was entirely absent.
Because you just cannot build a lasting institution when you are bleeding 125 points every single night.
No, you can't. And that structural integrity didn't really begin to materialize until a very specific personnel move in 1968.
The trade for Lenny Wilkens.
Yes. They acquired this methodical, brilliant point guard from St. Louis. And he eventually transitioned into a player coach role, which gave the franchise its first taste of a winning record in the early 1970s.
But the true permanent architectural shift, the moment the foundation truly sets, that doesn't happen until Wilkens returns solely as the head coach.
Right. Early in the 1977-1978 season. This is the ultimate turning point in the franchise's history.
Because Wilkens inherits a roster that had started the season in absolute freefall.
They were 5-17.
Yeah, 5-17. The team was entirely disjointed. They were underperforming their talent level. The locker room was fractured, and they were just hemorrhaging losses on a nightly basis.
And I really want to pause on that 5-17 record.
Please do, because
Right.
going from 5-17 to eventually finishing that season 42-18 and reaching the NBA Finals, that isn't just a culture shift.
It's a complete mathematical anomaly.
Exactly. It defies the logic of professional sports. I'm struggling to see how simply asking players to try harder translates to that level of an overnight turnaround.
Well, I wasn't just trying harder. What exactly did Wilkens do inside that locker room to re-engineer this team's DNA? He performed a complete psychological and schematic overhaul.
How so?
By demanding total submission to a defensive identity. To understand how he achieved this, you really have to look at the lineage of his methodology.
Okay.
It draws a direct parallel to the Boston Celtics ethos of the 1960s, which was instilled by Bill Russell.
And it's worth noting that Russell actually had a brief, somewhat turbulent coaching stint in Seattle just prior to Wilkins returning.
That's right. And the core philosophy Wilkins implemented was agonizingly simple to articulate,
Yeah.
but incredibly painful for professional athletes to execute.
Because a player must sacrifice his individual ego,
Yes, his scoring averages, his personal glory, all for the benefit of the collective defense.
meaning he had to convince high-scoring professionals to willingly stop shooting and start guarding.
Precisely. Wilkins looked at that 5 and 17 roster and diagnosed the core rot. They had raw talent, they had athletes, but they completely lacked defensive discipline and cohesion.
So he forced them into a system where communication was mandatory.
He demanded selfless rotation. He had to convince them that giving up a personal scoring opportunity on one end in order to expend maximum energy securing a defensive stop on the other was their only path to survival.
He essentially mathematically starved the opposition by making his players care more about denying a basket than making one.
And the data from the following year, their 1979 championship season, just proves that the overhaul was a resounding success.
Yeah, they posted a 52-30 regular season record. But the defining metric, the absolute core of this era, is what they did on the defensive side of the ball.
Right, they held opponents to just 103.9 points per game.
In a league where the average team was giving up 110.3 points, Seattle was suffocating the opposition. They were strangling teams.
And that defensive foundation is what allowed their specific personnel to thrive without needing a singular ball-dominant superstar.
Which is rare.
Very rare. When you look at the great teams of history, they usually have one gravitational force. Seattle had a brutally efficient, distributed machine.
Let's look at the 1979 finals against the Washington Bullets, which was a rematch of the previous year's finals. The output was incredibly clinical.
You had finals MVP Dennis Johnson anchoring the perimeter defense, and he was averaging 22.6 points, 6.0 rebounds, and 6.0 assists.
And you had Gus Williams leading the scoring charge with an incredible 28.6 points per game in the finals.
Right. He ultimately amassed 454 total playoff points during that run.
And when you look at the interior, you have a second-year center in Jack Sikma, and he wasn't playing like a sophomore. He was a relentless force, averaging 15.6 points and 12.4 rebounds.
Plus, off the bench, you had veteran Fred Downtown Brown, providing lethal, precise perimeter shooting.
It was a perfectly calibrated ecosystem, and the success of that ecosystem fundamentally altered the cultural topography of the Pacific Northwest.
Absolutely. Prior to 1979, Seattle had never won a major modern professional sports championship. The civic response to this title was seismic.
During the following 1979-1980 season, the franchise set an NBA attendance record.
They were averaging 21,725 fans per game inside the massive concrete dome of the kingdom.
That season firmly established Seattle not merely as a viable market, but as a premier, rabid basketball stronghold.
So Wilkins essentially encoded a standard of aggressive, team-oriented defensive excellence into the franchise's DNA. He proved you could win a championship in Seattle without a traditional marquee center dominating the basketball.
But what's fascinating to me is how that genetic trait of defensive intensity would sort of lay dormant through the struggles of the 1980s.
Only to mutate a decade later.
Yes, because the team that rises in the 1990s feels completely different visually, but it shares that exact same defensive bedrock.
And the architecture of that 1990s dominance began quietly in the draft room, specifically under general manager Wally Walker.
Walker made a calculated massive risk in 1989 that would define the entire decade. He drafted Shawn Kemp straight out of a junior college, Trinity Valley in Texas.
Right. Kemp hadn't played a single second of Division I college basketball. He was entirely unproven against elite competition.
And drafting an unknown teenager in the first round back in 1989, that was a fireable offense if the player failed.
But Walker's internal scouting profile compared Kemp to a hybrid of Charles Barkley's physical maturity and power, combined with Dominique Wilkins' explosive leaping ability.
And then exactly 1 year later, in 1990, Walker drafts a brash, intensely competitive, defensive-minded point guard named Gary Payton.
So the pieces are on the board.
But pieces without a system are just unrealized potential.
Exactly. The catalyst that activated Kemp and Payton was the hiring of head coach George Karl midway through the 1991-1992 season.
And crucially, Karl's reliance on his assistant coach, Bob Kloppenberg.
Yes. Kloppenberg was the architect of a defensive scheme known as the SOS system, which stood for Screen Over Switch.
Now, I want to push back heavily on the popular historical narrative of the 1990s Sonics here.
Go ahead.
If you look at highlight reels from that era, the Sonics are remembered almost exclusively as an offensive juggernaut.
Right. They were Lob City a decade before the term was even invented.
You see Kemp catching thunderous alley-oops from Payton, high-flying fast breaks, pure offensive entertainment. But the numbers suggest their true engine, the actual mechanism of their dominance, wasn't their offense at all.
No, it wasn't.
It was Kloppenburg's suffocating, exhausting defense. The highlights we remember were merely the byproduct of the sheer terror they inflicted on the other end of the court.
You are absolutely right to challenge that narrative. To understand the mechanics of the SOS defense is to understand how it literally broke the standard geometry of an NBA court.
It was a system built on aggressive traps, relentless ball pressure, and something called scram switching.
Now you have to remember, in the 1990s, zone defense was strictly illegal in the NBA.
Right, you had to play man-to-man.
Exactly. But Kloppenburg essentially designed a quasi-zone. It relied on funneling opposing ball handlers into very specific checkpoints on the floor where they were suddenly trapped by multiple defenders.
Paint a picture for us on this. How exactly does a team execute scram switching within a man-to-man restriction without constantly getting penalized?
Because it requires 5 players to function as if they are tethered together on a single string.
Right.
So imagine the opposing team's point guard brings the ball up the floor. Gary Payton immediately picks him up at full court, hounding him for 94 feet, applying immense physical pressure.
The opposing point guard calls for a screen.
And in a normal defense, the Tivans might fight through the screen or execute a standard switch. But in the SOS system, the moment the ball handler comes off the screen, Payton and another defender violently crap him.
Which forces the ball handler to make a panicked pass.
And this is where the interior players have to do the dirty work. Behind that trap, you had a player like Sam Perkins doing the brutal, unglamorous interior work.
If a switch occurred and a smaller guard was suddenly caught guarding an elite, massive post player, the Sonics didn't just accept the mismatch.
No, in a fraction of a second, as the ball was in the air, they scrammed the small guard out of the post and dropped a larger forward down to take the assignment.
Where does Shawn Kemp fit into all this chaos?
Kemp was the ultimate weapon in this scheme.
Yeah.
Because Perkins was anchoring the interior switches, Kemp was allowed to operate as an omnipresent help defender.
He was a rover.
Exactly. He would recognize a trap on the strong side of the floor and completely abandon his man on the weak side, flying across the lane to swat shots or jump into passing lanes.
They were constantly racking up illegal defense calls because they were constantly testing the very limits of the rulebook.
They left players open on the weak side for fractions of a second to swarm the ball. But mathematically, the disruption, the sheer panic it caused, completely overwhelmed the penalty of the occasional referee's whistle.
And the metrics from the source material detail exactly how devastating this math was. For 4 consecutive seasons, the Seattle Supersonics led the entire NBA in steals.
Let's look at the 1993-1994 season alone. They recorded a franchise record 1,053 steals.
They generated a massive 18.2% turnover rate. That means on nearly 1 out of every 5 possessions, the opposing team literally buckled under the pressure and handed the ball over.
So the half-court trapping directly fueled the explosive transition offense.
A steal by Payton inevitably led to a fast break, which ended in a trailing, rim-shaking dunk by Kemp. The defense was the offense.
And the result of that system was sustained, elite excellence. That 1993-1994 season, they posted a 63-19 record.
Dominating both at home with 37 wins and on the road with 26.
2 years later, in the 1995-1996 season, they achieved a franchise-best 64-18 record, slicing through the Western Conference and ultimately reaching the NBA Finals.
Where they faced Michael Jordan's historic 72-win Chicago Bulls, ultimately falling in a grueling 6-game series.
But there is a crucial physical component to this era of dominance that we have to examine because it becomes the very instrument of the franchise's eventual death.
Right. The frenetic, chaotic basketball of the 1990s required a specific physical environment to truly thrive. The team's original home, the Seattle Center Coliseum, was aging rapidly.
So in 1995, it was gutted and reborn as Key Arena.
And the financial and structural data regarding this rebuild is the first major incision in our autopsy. The details of the Key Arena renovation are critical.
The total project cost was $104 million.
It was funded primarily by $73.4 million in public city bonds, with the Sonics ownership contributing $21 million.
The capacity was set at a very intimate 17,072 seats. Structurally, the architects preserved the Coliseum's original, iconic, sloping roofline,
But to increase the seating capacity within that restrictive original footprint, they literally excavated the floor, lowering the court 35 feet into the ground.
which created an absolute fortress. Because the seats were pitched so steeply down toward the sunken floor, the acoustics were terrifying for opposing teams.
It was widely acknowledged as one of the loudest, most intimidating buildings in the entire league. It was perfectly suited to amplify the chaotic, trapping energy of the SOS defense. The building literally held the sound in.
It did. But here's where we find the fatal structural flaw.
Right.
The architectural limitations required to fit a modern NBA arena inside the shell of a 1962 World's Fair building acted as a slow-release financial poison.
The building was loud, yes. It was intimate. But in the modern economics of professional sports, intimacy does not generate corporate revenue.
Exactly. This specific structural reality, the lack of scalable high-end hospitality spaces, would slowly rot the relationship between the franchise and the city.
Let's actually shift our clinical focus away from the hardwood and up into the luxury suites. We are moving into the boardroom decay.
In 1983, a local media magnate named Barry Ackerley purchased the Supersonics from the original owner, Sam Shulman.
The purchase price was reported to be between $11 million and $22 million. Ackerley oversaw the massive boom of the 1990s.
But as the new millennium dawned, the landscape of the NBA was changing, and Ackerley sought an exit.
So in 2001, he sold the Supersonics and the WNBA's Seattle Storm for $200 million.
The buyer was the Basketball Club of Seattle, which was an ownership group led by Howard Schultz, the billionaire CEO of Starbucks.
And when Schultz took control of the franchise, he was highly visible and highly vocal. He explicitly promised a fan-centric approach.
He stated publicly that he intended to run the basketball team with the exact same ethos and corporate efficiency he used to build his global coffee empire.
He initiated intense top-to-bottom reviews of the game presentation at Key Arena. He focused obsessively on the customer experience,
going so far as to complain about burnt-out light bulbs on the arena scoreboard and the poor audio quality of the public address system.
which, I mean, that sounds great if you are managing a retail storefront. But applying the uniform, rigid corporate efficiency of a global coffee chain to a professional sports franchise is a profound, almost arrogant miscalculation.
It really is. Schultz fundamentally failed to account for the unique leverage, the outsized personalities, and the massive egos of NBA superstars.
He demanded absolute professionalism, corporate deference, and public compliance. And that immediately ignited friction in the locker room.
And that friction is most vividly illustrated by his absolute disdain for Gary Payton.
Payton was the beating heart of the franchise. He was beloved by the fans specifically for his abrasive, hyper-competitive, relentless trash-talking demeanor.
He was the identity of the team. But Schultz viewed Payton's behavior as selfish, unprofessional, and detrimental to the corporate brand he was trying to build.
The clash was inevitable. It came to a head when Payton, attempting to leverage a contract extension, simply failed to show up on the first day of training camp in 2002.
For a player, it's a standard, albeit aggressive, negotiating tactic. But for a corporate CEO like Schultz, it was an unforgivable act of insubordination.
Schultz's patience instantly evaporated. This culture clash culminated in the February 2003 trade that sent Gary Payton, the defining player of the era, to the Milwaukee Bucks in exchange for Ray Allen.
While the Payton trade signaled a massive destabilization of the front office and severed the emotional tie to the 1990s, the deeper terminal decay was occurring on the financial ledgers.
As we noted, Key Arena was rebuilt in 1995, but by the early 2000s, the economics of the NBA had shifted at light speed.
Rival teams were building sprawling, massive, taxpayer-funded palaces designed specifically to maximize secondary revenue streams.
We're talking clubs, restaurants, expansive luxury suites. Let's look at the actual numbers behind Key Arena's fatal flaw, because this is where the autopsy reveals the cause of death.
The 1995 renovation left the building economically obsolete, almost the exact moment the ribbon was cut.
Because of the restricted footprint under that old roof, it severely lacked a luxury box footprint. Furthermore, it possessed only 1,500 square feet of restaurant and bar space.
Compare that to the Toyota Center in Houston, built in 2003, which boasted 12,000 square feet of high-margin hospitality space.
It is the economic difference between running a corner cafe and operating a multi-level premium nightclub.
Because Key Arena lacked this premium inventory, Schultz's ownership group found themselves trapped. They were locked into a revenue-sharing lease with the city.
A lease that NBA Commissioner David Stern publicly counted the worst in the entire league. Schultz stated on the record that his group of 58 investors lost $60 million over a 5-year period.
And hemorrhaging that kind of money forced Schultz's hand. He issued a stark ultimatum to the city of Seattle.
He demanded a massive $220 million public renovation to Key Arena to expand the footprint and add those revenue-generating spaces.
From a purely clinical business perspective, Schultz was operating a deeply flawed asset. He had overpaid for a franchise at $200 million, placed it in a building that could not mathematically generate modern corporate profits, and was tied to an unfavorable lease.
He needed the taxpayers to bail out his investment. But the city of Seattle was still actively paying off the debt from the 1995 Key Arena bonds.
Furthermore, the public had just recently funded bonds for a new baseball stadium, Safeco Field, and a new football stadium, Seahawks Stadium.
The political appetite for handing another $220 million to a billionaire was non-existent. And when the city balked at his demand, Schultz's reaction was swift.
Schultz's ownership style is almost tragic when you look back on it.
It really is. He came in acting remarkably like an obsessive romantic partner. He showered the franchise with intense, smothering attention for that first year.
He made these grandiose public promises about community trust, about redefining the culture of professional sports in Seattle.
But the very second reality hit. The moment the player egos pushed back, the moment the financial losses mounted, the moment the politicians refused his demands, he completely withdrew.
He grew bored, bitter, and resentful. His sudden withdrawal of enthusiasm completely destabilized the organization.
He essentially threw his hands up, declared the situation untenable, and decided to wash his hands of the franchise entirely.
His frustration reached a breaking point. By early 2006, the team was quietly placed on the market.
Unable to extract the profits he envisioned from Key Arena, Schultz prioritized a quick financial exit, effectively setting the stage for an out-of-state takeover. The local stewards had failed.
Which brings us to the final fatal era, the hostile takeover involving Clay Bennett, David Stern, and the absolute blockade at the Washington State Legislature.
On July 18, 2006, Howard Schultz sold the Seattle Supersonics and the Seattle Storm for $350 million.
The buyer was the Professional Basketball Club LLC, known as PBC. This was an investment group based entirely out of Oklahoma City, led by a prominent businessman named Clay Bennett.
And the geographical context of this purchase is vital to understanding the motive.
Right. Oklahoma City had recently hosted the NBA's New Orleans Hornets for 2 seasons following the devastation of Hurricane Katrina.
The city had supported the displaced team vigorously. They sold out half of their games and averaged over 18,000 fans in attendance.
This 2-year audition proved definitively to the NBA Board of Governors that Oklahoma City was a highly viable, lucrative basketball market.
And Clay Bennett had been instrumental in bringing the Hornets to his city temporarily. He formed PBC with the explicit, publicly stated goal of securing a permanent NBA franchise for his hometown.
And yet, upon purchasing the Sonics, Bennett stood at a press conference podium in Seattle and looked the city in the eye, claiming his intention was to keep the team in the Pacific Northwest.
The caveat, of course, was that he required taxpayers to heavily subsidize a new arena. Let's trace the massive escalation of his financial demands.
Because he didn't ask for the $220 million renovation that Schultz had asked for.
No. Instead, on February 13, 2007, Bennett demanded a brand new $500 million arena, specifically a $530 million facility to be built in the Seattle suburb of Renton.
And he demanded that taxpayers foot at least $300 million of that bill.
If we look at the provided documents in the timeline, it becomes analytically clear that Bennett's exorbitant demands were structurally designed to be rejected.
Absolutely. He was presenting a $300 million public funding request to a populace that was politically and financially exhausted.
The citizens of Seattle and King County were already heavily taxed. They were still paying off the $104 million Key Arena debt from 1995.
The $517 million for the Mariners Safeco Field.
And the $430 million for the Seahawks Stadium. Asking for another $300 million was a calculated impossibility.
And the political roadblocks weren't just theoretical, they were legislated into law. The voters made their stance undeniable.
In November 2006, Seattle voters overwhelmingly passed Initiative 91. And this wasn't a narrow margin. It passed with a staggering 71% plurality.
Initiative 91 legally restricted any taxpayer subsidies for professional sports teams unless those specific investments generated a guaranteed, measurable profit for the city.
It was a massive, legally binding no to billionaires asking for handouts.
And that blockade extended from the local ballot boxes straight to the state capitol in Olympia. The proposed funding mechanism for Bennett's $530 million Renton Arena was a $278 million tax package.
This package would have required extending King County restaurant, hotel, and car rental taxes for decades.
But State House Speaker Frank Chop, recognizing the intense public opposition, flatly refused to even allow the measure to come to a floor vote. He killed it in committee.
The resistance was so resolute that even when private, massive capital stepped in to bridge the gap, the political doors remained bolted shut.
Steve Ballmer, the incredibly wealthy CEO of Microsoft and a Seattle resident, offered $150 million of his own money as a philanthropic gift toward a scaled-down $300 million rebuild of Key Arena.
Ballmer's only condition was that the legislature authorize a public vote to match the remaining funds through continued nuisance taxes.
But Frank Chop blocked this proposal as well. The legislative avenue was permanently sealed.
Throughout this political impasse, NBA Commissioner David Stern took an unusually active, highly visible, and distinctly hostile role.
Stern actually traveled to Olympia to lobby the state legislature personally.
When Speaker Chop rebuffed the commissioner of the NBA, Stern took the political rejection as a profound personal insult to his authority and to the league's leverage.
Stern stated publicly that there was no heart whatsoever for assisting a Sonics team in Washington state.
He then issued a chilling retaliatory threat. If the Sonics left, the NBA would likely never return to Seattle on his watch.
But we really have to look past the posturing of good faith negotiations here.
Right, because the illusion that Bennett's group ever intended to stay in the Pacific Northwest shatters when you look at a massive mask slip that occurred just weeks after the sale was finalized.
This is crucial. On August 12, 2006, Sonics co-owner Aubrey McClendon, a partner in PBC, gave an interview to an Oklahoma business newspaper.
He explicitly stated, "We didn't buy the team to keep it in Seattle. We hope to come here."
The NBA immediately scrambled to contain the PR disaster. They fined McClendon $250,000 for the comments. But the damage was done. The truth was out.
That blatant admission of intent confirmed the absolute worst fears of the fan base and local politicians. It hardened their resolve against providing a single cent of public funds.
It provided concrete, public evidence that the good faith clause built into the franchise sale agreement, a clause which legally required Bennett to spend 12 months trying to secure a Seattle arena, was nothing more than a legal facade.
It completely shifted the battlefield. With the political avenues in Olympia's dead and the ownership's true predatory motives exposed in the press, the battle over the Sonics' existence moved from the legislative floor into a federal courtroom.
Which initiates the final phase of our autopsy, the legal breakdown and the settlement.
In September 2007, the city of Seattle initiated a desperate legal maneuver. City Attorney Tom Carr filed a lawsuit aiming to strictly enforce the existing Key Arena lease.
That lease legally bound the Supersonics to play all their home games in the building through the end of the 2010 season.
A victory for the city would effectively trap Clay Bennett in Seattle for 2 more agonizing years. It would buy local leaders precious time to find a local buyer like Steve Ballmer, who could purchase the team and keep it in town.
In response to the city's lawsuit, Clay Bennett filed for arbitration to escape the lease early. His legal arguments centered on the massive financial hemorrhage his group was suffering under the Key Arena revenue-sharing model.
He pointed directly back to that structural flaw we analyzed earlier, the severe lack of viable restaurant and luxury suite space, arguing that forcing the team to stay would cause undue financial ruin.
This legal conflict culminated in a highly publicized, deeply tense 6-day federal trial in July 2008, presided over by U.S. District Judge Marcia Pechman.
The trial was grueling. Witnesses were deposed, private emails regarding the move to Oklahoma City were exposed, financial ledgers were laid bare in court.
The city felt it had a strong, ironclad legal case to enforce the terms of a signed lease.
The judge was scheduled to issue her final binding ruling at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, July 2, 2008. But that ruling never came.
No, it didn't. Just hours before the envelope was opened, a final settlement was suddenly announced to the public. Clay Bennett had effectively bought his way out of Seattle.
The exact terms of that final settlement are critical to the autopsy report. Bennett agreed to pay the city of Seattle $45 million immediately in cash for the right to terminate the lease 2 years early.
Furthermore, the agreement included a conditional $30 million payment due in 2013.
However, this second payment was highly conditional. It would only be triggered if the Washington state legislature authorized $75 million for key arena renovations by the end of 2009, and if Seattle failed to obtain a new NBA franchise within 5 years.
Let's look at this decision by the city council to accept the settlement. They had legal high ground, they had a signed lease. Why capitulate hours before a federal judge was set to rule?
The city council's decision was rooted in the fear of a Pyrrhic victory. From a strictly legal standpoint, winning the trial meant keeping a deeply resentful absentee ownership group in town for 2 lame duck seasons.
During those 2 years, Bennett would likely trade away any remaining valuable player assets, fields an intentionally non-competitive roster, and the city would suffer abysmal, embarrassing attendance figures.
At the end of the 2010 season, the lease would expire and Bennett would leave for Oklahoma City anyway, legally free and clear.
The city would be left with zero financial compensation, absolutely zero leverage with the NBA, and an empty, aging Key Arena still burdened by the 1995 debt.
The politicians looked at the guaranteed $45 million cash payout, which would immediately pay off the building's mortgage, and they chose the path of least fiscal resistance.
But we have to measure the catastrophic long-term cultural cost of that sudden capitulation. The physical aftermath was instantaneous and brutal.
A young Kevin Durant, who had been drafted just a year prior and offered a glimmer of future hope, was immediately shipped 2,000 miles away to Oklahoma City.
The Seattle Supersonics name, the green and gold colors, and a duplicate set of their championship trophies were left behind in the Pacific Northwest, boxed up like artifacts in a museum vault.
By taking that $45 million payout to clear a mortgage, the city traded the permanent cultural and economic erasure of a 41-year civic institution for what amounts to a rounding error in the modern economics of professional sports.
It was a transaction resulting in deep, lasting civic trauma. The immediate infusion of cash solved a short-term municipal debt crisis regarding the arena's bonds.
But it created a generational void in the city's cultural identity. A city that had defined itself by the aggressive, communal joy of the 1979 championship and the 1990s dominance was suddenly completely disconnected from the sport.
Which brings us to the final, chilling extrapolation of this autopsy. By allowing the Supersonics to be extracted, disassembled, and relocated with such clinical efficiency, the NBA didn't just punish Seattle for refusing to pay for a billionaire's arena.
No, they didn't. They created a terrifying permanent blueprint for civic extortion.
You really have to ask yourself, how is the ghost of the Seattle Supersonics being weaponized today?
That empty space on the Seattle skyline is now a silent, looming threat in boardrooms across North America. When a billionaire owner sits across from a mayor in Milwaukee or Sacramento or any other mid-sized market and demands hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies for a new stadium.
They don't have to raise their voice. They don't have to yell.
They simply have to point to the dust where a 41-year champion used to stand and ask a very simple question.
Do you want to be the next Seattle?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.